Welcome back. It's week 43 of Cornerstone's Bible in a Year series, One House. So it's now week 3 of our read through the Gospels, which tell us about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, the most important part of our faith by far. So far, we've talked about the difference between the Old and New Testaments and how each gospel was written in a different way to tell a different aspect of the story of Jesus. So before we get to the passage for today, let's take a look this week at when, why, and how the Gospels were written. So first of all, let's look at how. In a very simple way, it was written with a quill and ink on vellum, which is sheepskin, or on papyrus, which is the closest thing that they had to paper. We say that simply, but there's no way we can have any comprehension of simply how difficult it was to create and write a single page. You couldn't just grab a pen and write it down, or like today we've got computers. I've got it in front of me here right now. In order to have the pen, you had to have the right type of fowl, the right type of bird that had the right type of feather, and pick that feather off and then shave the feather. And that is by far the simplest part of it. Ink, where do you get ink? You don't just go to the store and buy ink. You have to create the ink by putting it together from different blends of berries or other different things that had these colors in them with the correct consistencies. Okay. And then they wouldn't last all that long, because if you're creating ink out of natural things like berries, they go bad after a while. So there's only a certain amount of time that you can use them. So you had to go through a whole process of that. And then the hardest part of all, the thing to write it on. Imagine if you're writing on vellum, which is sheepskin. So you've got the sheep, you shear the sheep, and finally you get to the point where the sheep are too old to be sheared anymore. And so you kill them so that you can eat the meat from them, and you eat the meat from them. And then you have to trim off all of the skin. You have to get a large enough piece of it that then can be dried and flattened and smoothed in a way that you can write on it, and that will maintain the ink, and that will hold for long enough for people to be able to pass it around and read it for years to come, possibly. Or papyrus, which is made out of reeds, kind of like we make paper today, but you got to go through the whole process of growing the papyrus, of harvesting the papyrus, of going through whatever process that they went through to crush it and then to smooth it out, to wet it, to dry it, to flatten it, to make sure that the sheets are large enough. Bottom line is, only really, really wealthy people or people who were in the church or in the synagogue or in another institution of learning could put together the funds to be able to have, more than tiny little scraps upon which they could write. The average person would scratch something from, grab a stick, grab a berry, and scratch something on a rock. Or a piece of wood if you wanted it to be more portable, and you'd only get a word or two or a letter or two on that, and that was all they did. So just the fact that we have these books from this era and that they have been sustained over these years accurately is really from the providence of God that he's allowed this to happen, because it was so difficult. So they wrote it this way, and then they would pass it around because it was so precious. They would pass it from person to person. Nobody would just have it and keep it and like have a book on a shelf. First of all, they weren't done in books. They were done on scrolls or just simply flat sheets of paper. And then you'd pass them around to as many people as could get them, read them aloud. And then if someone else had the chance to be able to copy it on another piece of papyrus or vellum, they would do the same. So all of the Bible books that we have were regularly passed around, regularly read to others, and then regularly copied and taken to other places. And the speed with which the message spread through these ancient ways of communication was really extraordinary. We have, in fact, thousands of early manuscripts of the Bible, by far like hundreds of times more than we have of any manuscripts of any other ancient writings. So many of them that by contrasting and comparing them from different dates and different times and different places, we have an absolute certainty of the accuracy of what we're reading simply from a scientific basis. Forget faith. Don't forget faith, but aside from faith, the scientific study of this shows how accurate they are. Even if you don't believe in the Bible and what it's saying, you cannot deny from the archaeological and scientific evidence that what we have is an accurate representation of what they wrote at the time. And that right there is such a beginning basis for why we have confidence in what we read in the Bible, because we know that what we have is at least accurate for what they wrote at the time. So that's the first thing about how that it was written. Second thing, when. As mentioned earlier, Mark was the first of the Gospels written, but we didn't actually mention when that was, and we didn't compare it to any of the other Bible books. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first thing to know is that the New Testament was not written in the order that the books appear in our Bibles, except for Revelation, which is the last one that appears in our Bible, and it was the last one written. The first books that were written were not the Gospels, which appear first in our New Testament, but they were the letters, or what are sometimes called the epistles. Because what happened was this: as the church started spreading and talking about Jesus, and then they would hear back from maybe a church that they had planted in a town, and they'd hear, hey, they're not quite doing this thing right correctly. The person who planted that church or some other person that they respected would write and say, hey, you need to fix this. Or they'd hear that they were under persecution, and they'd write something to encourage them. Or they couldn't stay long enough to give the full teaching, and so they'd write later to finish up that teaching. Bottom line is, in the letters that we have, until we get to maybe Romans, and then when we get to the Gospels, and then when we get to Revelation, aside from those, nobody sat down and said, I'm going to write something that's going to go in the Bible. They didn't think they were writing the Bible. They were simply writing letters to other Christians to help them go along. And that feeling is in them. When we get to those, we'll talk about it when we get to that, because it's really, really cool to see the immediacy and the personality that comes through, because they were just writing from friend to friend, sometimes angrily, sometimes happily, sometimes sadly, all kinds of different ways that they were doing it. So they weren't, again, trying to write the Bible, which I think, to me, actually goes to its reliability. When someone sits down to write scripture because they want to start a religion, I don't trust that. But when someone is simply writing because they want to be truthful with a friend, that's something I have a greater degree of trust in. So anyway, from that, the first letters, the first parts of the New Testament that were written were the letters. Probably the first three letters written were James, which was written by James, the half-brother of Jesus, and First and Second Thessalonians and Galatians, which were written by Paul. Those four are almost always cited as the first four books written in the New Testament. Different scholars will disagree on which one was written at what time, but they were all probably written within about a 4-year span of time, from 50 to 53 AD. So which one actually came dead on first, and that really doesn't matter. But those are the first four books written, maybe or maybe not in the order that I gave it to you, doesn't really matter. Mark was probably the next book written. So maybe the fifth book, maybe the sixth book of the Bible written, probably in the early to mid 50s AD. So Mark was written fewer than 20 years after the events of Jesus took place. So if you're writing about an event that took place fewer than 20 years ago, that means that a lot of people who were at that event are still alive today, and you can go ask them and compare your notes to their notes. Okay. In fact, we know that this was written this early because there are some fragments of early copies of the New Testament. The oldest one is a small fragment that's simply been called P52. So you can actually look up, you can Google P52 papyrus, and you'll see this information for yourself. It's a fragment from the Gospel of John, and all experts date it from somewhere between 100 to 150 AD. So this is a copy of a copy of a copy. It's not the original thing written by John, but we have a copy from 150 to 150 AD of the Gospel of John. And we know that John was one of the last books of the Bible written, not one of the first ones, which means one of the last books of the Bible written has a copy that we have in our hands today in England. Okay, it exists today in a museum in England. That was written potentially 70 years after Jesus died. And that's a copy of a copy, okay? And it's one of the later ones, which means books like Mark were written earlier than that, and books like First and Second Thessalonians were written even earlier than that. So that's why every once in a while, cynics and skeptics of the Bible, we talk about those folks a lot, don't we? They'll come along and say, none of it was even written until 300 or 400 AD. They are either lying or they don't know what they're talking about, because P52 is carbon dated, or however they do the dating, is dated to 100 to 150 AD, and it is a quote from the Gospel of John. and John was one of the latest ones written. So this idea that it was all written so much later that they just made it all up simply doesn't hold any water whatsoever. So, in fact, this is how Luke actually starts his book. Luke starts his book by answering the how and the why questions of how and why the Gospels were written. So let's actually take a look. So if you want to know how the Gospels were written or why they were written, let's take a look from, and even when, let's take a look at the first few verses of what we'll be reading this week. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 says this: Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So Theophilus is the person he's writing to, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So what's he saying in the first 4 verses? Really important to break this down for you. Luke starts by saying that he's not the first one to write a gospel about Jesus, but many have attempted to do this. So we know Luke isn't the first because he says others have done this before me. Most of those attempts have been lost. We have 4 of them that we have any reliability on today: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He then says that he did research by talking to people who, quote, handed down what had been fulfilled, and, quote, that these things had been fulfilled among us, not among other people. And thirdly, he says it was from eyewitnesses. He interviewed people who saw these events occur, and he wrote it down at a time where he could say, these are things that happened among us, not among them way back in the day, but among us around today. There are people around today that I interviewed who saw this stuff, and I did multiple interviews with multiple people who actually saw these events take place. And then he says he investigated himself and he wrote it down in an orderly account. This is how a good journalist does their work. Right? So this gives you an idea of when he wrote it, when the people who witnessed it were still alive, how he wrote it by interviewing them and doing a careful investigation and then writing it out in an orderly way. But why did he write it? Well, verse 4, he tells us why he wrote it: so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So when he wrote it, when the people were still alive who saw it, when he wrote it, how he wrote it, by doing the investigation and putting it in an orderly way, and why he wrote it, so that we can know for certain that these things that seem crazy actually took place. So keep this in mind as you read the book of Luke. It's a really important way to begin this book. And because of the kind of old school way that those first 4 verses are written, we sometimes don't see what they mean, but that gives you a good understanding of it. So when you read it for yourself first thing this week, you'll see that as you read it. So keep that in mind as you read the book of Luke. This is a work of a researcher who interviewed many eyewitnesses so that we could be certain of these events, that they took place as he wrote them down. So let's take a look at what he wrote. First begins with the announcement and the birth of Jesus in Luke chapter 1. Chapter 1 through 2. Right after the first 4 verses, starting with verse 5 of chapter 1 all the way through verse 2. We first of all meet John the Baptist again, but this time we actually meet his parents, and we understand that not just Jesus' birth was miraculous, but that John the Baptist's birth was miraculous, and that John the Baptist was a close cousin of Jesus, that they're actually family members. So this is something that we hadn't seen before. Then we get to the Christmas story that is most often told every time a Christmas comes around. This is the version of the story with the shepherds, with the angel choir, and with the manger. So as you read that, that will be very familiar to you for those of us who are familiar with the Christmas story, which is pretty much all of us, isn't it? It's then followed by 2 episodes at the temple. One when Jesus was 8, when he went to be circumcised, and 2 people who were waiting for the Messiah recognized, hey, this baby is Messiah. And then when he was 12, where they head back home and, oh, Jesus is lost. We thought he was with others in the caravan. And he's there in the temple, listening to and speaking and asking wise questions of the elders, and says, I've got to be about my Father's business. That is, I'm in my Father's house, the temple. And they are the only 2 episodes in the Bible about young Jesus, like before other than the birth story, about Jesus as a young child. Matthew would be the other one where it talks about the wise men visiting probably when he was about 2. But Luke adds that 8-day-old one and adds the 12-year-old one. So the only picture we have of Jesus as an adolescent is what we'll be reading first this week in the beginning of Luke. All right, we then go to Luke chapter 3, where we come to John the Baptist again, this time John the Baptist's ministry, and it's followed by Jesus' genealogy, like we saw already in Matthew. But this time the genealogy of Jesus is given working its way backwards, starting with Jesus and going all the way back to Adam's creation by God himself. Immediately after that, we go to Luke 4 and the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. It is a fascinating story with so much to talk about. But for now, just a couple things to note as you read it yourself this week. First of all, notice that the temptations are to 3 very different aspects of our lives that are important to us. He appeals to his hunger, he appeals to power, and he appeals to pride. Take a look at that as you read the temptations of Jesus, and notice how Jesus answers all of them. He answers every single temptation by quoting scripture. Specifically, he quotes out of Deuteronomy for all 3 of them. But Jesus knew scripture well enough, and it was so much a part of who he was that he knew that the strength of scripture would be what sustained him against temptation. And it's the same for us. This is why we're reading the Bible together, so that we have the same scripture in us that we can draw on that Jesus had during his time of greatest temptation. We then move in chapters 4 through the beginning of 9 with the Galilee ministry, which we've talked about a couple times already, the region that he goes through near his hometown. And then at the end of 9, we're going to read about the region near Galilee, where he goes up to the north a little bit and over the river in the northern section outside of Israel's borders. Then he goes down to Judea in Luke 9 through 13, where he spends time around Jerusalem as the heat kind of builds on his ministry and his enemies continue to get angrier, as we've seen in both of the previous 2 Gospels. Then we have a slight departure in Luke. Luke, the end of 13 to the beginning of 19, a fairly long section where it talks about his ministry in Perea. Both Matthew and Mark, when they talk about the journey to Judea, I didn't mention it much before because it comes up so much here. They also mentioned his journeys into Perea, which was the area across the Jordan in the south. He's already been across the Jordan in the north, but he also journeyed a little bit across the Jordan River in the southern kingdom. In Matthew and Mark, it's barely mentioned, and it's mentioned kind of interacting with his time in Judea. But Luke spends more time there than the other two do combined. And when he's there, we see a ton of stories, like lepers being healed, his conversation with the rich young man who would not give up his treasures on earth for treasures in heaven, a blind man that Jesus heals so that he sees, a Zacchaeus who climbs up into the tree. All of that happens during that trip. And we see a whole lot of parables of Jesus, the 3 lost parables in Luke 15, the lost coin, the lost lamb, and the lost son are there. The parable of the persistent widow, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, all of that happens during his Perean ministry. But also notice from chapter 1831 on, take a look at what he says here, because from 1831 on, things have a shift in Luke. 1831, this is what happens. Jesus says, we are going up to Jerusalem. He's talking to his disciples, and he says, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. And then he goes on to say what's going to happen. I'm going to be turned over. I'm going to be crucified. And at that point on, his eyes are set to Jerusalem. And from that point on, I want you to imagine in your mind a straight line from where he is to Jerusalem. And he walks as straight as he can make it according to the highways of their day. When he goes through Jericho, for instance, where he meets Zacchaeus, or on his way to Jericho is where he meets Zacchaeus. When he goes through Jericho, Jericho is really close to Jerusalem. He is on his way. He set his sights on Jerusalem. The final week is about to happen. And then, of course, we get there. In Luke chapter 9, the end of 19 and all the way through chapter 24, we have once again the triumphant entry on Palm Sunday. He turns over the tables in the temple. He talks about his second coming in chapter 21 one more time. We have the Last Supper, the betrayal of Jesus, the trial, the cross, and the resurrection of Jesus. And what's interesting in this part about Luke is when we get to chapter 24, Luke has one of the longer post-resurrection accounts. There's not a lot said in the other gospels about what happened after his resurrection. Luke does a lot more, and when we get to John, we'll see quite a bit that happens after his resurrection as well. And you're also going to note this: Luke is the only one to mention Jesus' ascension in any detail whatsoever. Matthew doesn't mention it at all. John won't mention it at all. Mark gives only one little verse at the end of the book, but Luke and Acts both spend some time on Jesus ascending into heaven, and Luke and Acts were both written by the same author. So Luke, the doctor, the educated one, the one who did the research, is the only one who spends any time on Jesus ascending into heaven, which is really fascinating to me because, as we conclude, Luke is a favorite book of people who like science, who like medicine, and who like building logical arguments, because that's what Luke does here. But when we talk about miracles like the ascension, the resurrection, blind eyes being opened, we have this idea that people who like research and like science, well, they just look at that and go, it's a bunch of nonsense, right? But the person in the Bible who was the most educated, and we know Luke was really well educated because those who read Greek, I don't, but those who read the Greek language tell us that the Greek language that's used in the Gospel of Luke is a much more highly educated form of the language than in the other three Gospels. So Luke was a very, very highly educated man. Paul as well, when he writes his epistles, his letters, he uses a very high educated form of Greek. It's like today you can read, basic English, or you can read somebody who really knows how to use the language and it's really elevated. Well, same thing with Greek. That's how we know Luke was well educated. Plus, he tells us at the beginning. So here he is. He's a scientist. He's a logical person. He's highly educated. He's writing to other highly educated people. He's done his research, but he doesn't shy away from miracles. So why wouldn't a person of, academic, rigor shy away from miracles? Well, because he did the research. He actually spends more time in the miracles than the others do because he did the research and he discovered it actually happened. He actually did heal those people. He actually did rise from the dead. He actually did ascend into heaven. I talked to a lot of people who were there and who saw it, and I believe them because their testimony is reliable. We have the opposite way. We usually think, if you're logical, you can't believe in miracles. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, had put together what is today called the Jefferson Bible. And what he did was he bought 2 copies of the Bible because it's printed on both sides, and he cut out of the New Testament any miracles and only has the logical, scientific teaching and events of Jesus' life that weren't miraculous. And it's called the Jefferson Bible. You can Google it and see for yourself that that's how he put it together. Why? Because Jefferson, a man of learning, couldn't believe in the miracles. But Luke, one of the smartest men of the New Testament, the guy who researched it the most and talked to the most eyewitnesses, went, I don't know what to tell you. They happened, and I'm putting it in my book. It's really extraordinary. So he did the research. So I encourage you, read it for yourself. See the results of his research, the results of a man of science who heard these crazy stories, who decided to do the work, to do the research, who interviewed eyewitnesses, and who walked away going, wow, this really happened. It's an extraordinary thing to read. I hope you'll get that out of it and even more as you read it through this week, and we'll see you next week.